As everybody who rents privately knows, rents have went up quite substantially in the last 5 years, with rents in Scotland overall going up 62% since 2010, so above inflation. While in Glasgow, they went up by 84%, and Edinburgh, or the Lothians, they went up over 100%. With the SNP just scrapping their limited rent controls last month, I thought this would be a good time to give a brief overview of the history of the Scottish National Party and rent inflation. You would think, given the Scottish National Party presents itself as a left-wing party that is for ordinary people, like workers and tenants, that given the numbers I just gave you at the start of the video, rent inflation would be a core issue that they've been trying to address while in government. Since the 1990s, the private rental sector doubled in Scotland. And post-2008 financial crash, private rents increased at quite a substantial pace. During this entire time, post-crash, the SNP have governed Scotland, and during this time they have done effectively very little to address this rent inflation. It took the party until 2022, late 2022, following COVID-19, to propose and enact any legislation to try and combat rent inflation. And even this legislation only occurred because it was pushed by their coalition partner at the time, the Scottish Greens, and due to a lot of pressure from grassroots tenant organisations. And these new rent controls were so weak that in the time period while they were in force, so from October 2022 until last month, rent in Scotland actually increased at a faster rate than it did before the legislation was enacted. And even more surprisingly, the rent during the period, the rent increased in Scotland faster and higher than it did in England, which had no rent controls at all. This was because although this legislation prevented landlords from raising rent within one tenancy, they were still allowed and no limitations were placed on how much they could raise rent between two separate tenancies, meaning landlords could and did effectively raise rents as much as they wanted over the medium term. In response to criticism around their record, the Scottish National Party will usually point to their new renters bill that's currently in Parliament, the housing bill. This bill does propose rent controls, but similar to the previous rent controls enacted by the SNP, these rent controls proposed in the bill are also quite weak. Most notably, the controls will not automatically apply if the bill is passed. They would only come into action if local authorities or local councils decide to enact them, which may well not happen given the amount of politicians on local councils who oppose rent controls. In addition to this, even if councils or local authorities did decide to impose these rent controls, there are a lot of properties, including student accommodations, which have been made exempt by the SNP from these controls, so rent there could still raise effectively as much as the landlord wanted. Additionally, even under this legislation, rents can still increase by 1% above inflation each year, which doesn't seem like that much, but that effectively means that rents in Scotland, even if rent controls are imposed, could still increase by 10% every decade, which isn't that much of a long-term rent control project. Regardless of whether it was because of private lobbying from private development firms or landlords, or just ineptitude in terms of policy creation, the SNP's approach towards rent inflation over their now nearly 20 years in power has effectively been a failure. The party has clearly not been on the side of private renters during its time at the head of the Scottish government.